Hello everybody. Thank you for coming here. On behalf of Oxford Business College and Prabha Khaitan Foundation, I welcome all of you to this event of the Right Circle. And it's being organized under the auspices of British Council. Oxford Business College partnered with Prabha Khaitan Foundation around 5 years ago with the project of the Right Circle. The purpose is to promote Indian-based English authors. And Prabha Khaitan Foundation is an NGO based in Kolkata, India since 2015, organizing these events in more than 40 cities of India, Singapore, Norway, USA, and here the UK. And today is a very special event as we have the most celebrity star journalist from India, but not in India, rather in subcontinent. She has huge fan followings apart from India, from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. And it's an honor to have Barkha Dutt in Oxford in our premises today. From her ground reality, she has come up with this beautiful book on humans of COVID to hell and back. It's one of the best sellers in India at the moment. And we have Mira Kaushik, who will be talking to Barkha today. Mira ji is an independent culture activist, former director of Academy, and being honored by the Queen of UK with OBE. So thank you, Mira ji. This event will be for about 40 to 45 minutes talk, and then we'll have 10-15 minutes of audience question answers. And then Barkha ji will sign the books for all of you. So thank you very much, and I give a stage to you, Mira ji.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Best wishes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, I come from the world of culture, and within the South Asian tradition, there are jugalbandis.
Yes.
And every time two artists come on stage, they say, we have never met, but we are going to do a jugalbandi.
Yes.
And we'll perform together. And of course, it's not true, because they have rehearsed.
Well, we really haven't.
And so this is the true jugalbandi we are doing today,
yes.
where we have never met. So, to everyone, good afternoon. It's a privilege to interview writer Barkha Dutt, who's better known as a journalist who changed many things for women of her generation. Her Wikipedia page, because I haven't got your CV, tells us that she was born in Delhi to an Air India official, Mr. S.P. Datta and Prabha Dutt. Sorry, it's Dutt.
Yes.
Yes. A pioneer journalist. And she also has a journalist sister, Barkha Dutt. Barkha went to Morton School and St. Stephen's College, where she studied English literature. And this was followed by Jamia Millia and Columbia University. And I insist on sort of giving this introduction to you because I know many of you may not know that. In 2008, she received Padma Shri, which is an eminent award from Indian government. She is an established face of the millennium's journalism, and she has been an inspirational figure. Now, she has written many, she has been writing regularly, but her first book, This Unquiet Land, Stories from India's Fault Line, was published in 2016. Before that, she contributed a chapter in Nothing New, Women as Victim, which was written in 2002. And her third book, To Hell and Back, was published this year, and we are celebrating that work in this interview. Barkha is known for many controversies, many trolls, and all her politics and political views. But today, we are talking to an author. And if things happen in between, fine. Otherwise, I would like to really know this person more. So, Barkha, when did you start practicing your autograph?
My autograph. Okay, hi everyone.
You have to share the mic.
I think you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, and what an interesting question. This is a question that I've never been asked before. I don't know. Even today, if somebody comes up and says, can you sign this for me? It feels very odd, and it feels very odd because I'm used to being a reporter. I'm used to being not the subject, but the chronicler. So when I am treated like the subject, I find it very odd. And I think even today I respond with a certain amount of shyness, a certain amount of discomfort. I'm not shy otherwise. But if someone treats me as the subject, I find it very peculiar. And to be completely honest, I've tried very hard to never let the idea of the reporter become the idea of the subject. Because I feel that if journalists start seeing themselves as public figures, good, bad, ugly, you won't do your job. My job is to be a storyteller, not to be the story. It's a different matter that sometimes I end up being the story and I deal with it in different ways. But I don't remember that one moment. I suppose the first time that I got a lot of public attention was when I was still in my mid-20s and I had gone to Kargil. There was a war between India and Pakistan. I see friends from Pakistan here. Some of you will remember that time. And I went to the front line to report that war. And I had to really fight with my organization then, NDTV, with the military, because they said we can't send a woman to the front line. And my mother, Prabha, 30 years ago, had also covered an India-Pakistan war and was in fact India's first woman to report a war. So right after Kargil, I suppose, was the first time that kind of public attention on me. And today I'm 50, at that time I was 26 and a half, 27, and it felt so strange. And it still feels strange. So to answer the question, I try and not notice that moment because it interferes with my instinct as a storyteller.
Thank you. So your life and all your work has been in the public eye. Public gaze has been on you. What is your current narrative about yourself? And how it has evolved?
I have to first say I'm just loving this interview because there's a freshness in your questions, and I think it comes from your own experience in culture and the literary world, because otherwise we'd asked very standard questions and we don't even have to think, we just answer them on autopilot. So thank you for the questions. My narrative about myself, if you had asked me the same question 2 years ago, I would have said, I think I'm having a midlife crisis. I'm bored. I am nothing new. I don't know what to do next. Kar liya. In Hindi we say, I've done it. Been there, worn the t-shirt, now what? I've climbed the mountain, now the next is the plateau. I would have said this. However, the last 2 years and a few months, I have found I won't say a new narrative, but a rediscovery of my old self. So a lot of people say to me, is this Barkha 2.0? And I say, no, it's Barkha 1.0. I just rediscovered her. There's great joy in that rediscovery. And for those who may not be aware here, basically, I used to work in television. And at some point, after about 22 years, bored, also disillusioned, I said, I want to do something of my own. I'm tired of being an employee. I want to be an entrepreneur. I also felt that the future was moving very fast to digital. Even when people were watching TV, they were consuming that content on their phones, on their laptops. And I'm sure a lot of you, even here, when you watch TV, you consume it like that. So in 2019, the end of it, I decided that I will set up a digital platform called Mojo. Mojo means magic. And to try and rediscover the magic of journalism. And by coincidence, there was a lot of things happening in the news cycle, and then a couple of months later, COVID happened. And I spent the last 2 years, sorrowful years, but strangely through that sorrow, I would say some of my best work, traveling across India in a small car with 3 other people, including the driver, a producer, and a camera person. I traveled from the north of India to the south of India by road. Why by road? Because in the first wave, our public transport was shut down because of the lockdown. In the second wave, the airports opened and I was able to fly, but I was still flying all across India. And in the first year of COVID, I traveled 30,000 kilometers by road, spending 120 days literally on the road, reaching Kerala, which many of you would know is in the very south of India. After this work, if you were to ask me, what is my narrative? I think my narrative is that I am back in touch with being a storyteller. I have discovered the power of storytelling. I have discovered the capacity for storytelling to change lives and touch lives. And I think in a very noisy media age, I am back to telling the stories of people whose stories you don't hear otherwise. And in that narrative, I have found myself again. Thank you. Ma'am.
So, how did you write your first book, which was rather late?
Yes.
And what was the difference in your discipline of being a journalist and an author? How did you cope with that?
Another great question. You know, people think, those of us who are in the media, we'll find it very easy to write. Firstly, you have to understand that I come from a medium where I wrote to pictures. I wrote to pictures. So that's a very different discipline. So just to give you a small example, I always give this example. In 2003, there was a very big tsunami that hit the coast of South India. And I had gone to cover that tsunami. And I'll never forget one visual. You know, everything was flooded, there were mass graves, bodies had been washed ashore. And there was this one home where there was a clock. The clock obviously used to be on the wall, but it had fallen in the water. And it had fallen in the water, and obviously its needles had stopped working because of the storm. So it was stuck at some 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And you know, we were finding that clock late at night. And when I was writing the script for that, I had the visual of that clock. And I wrote, "Time stood still in Nagapattinam," because I had the visual, and the visual was telling that story. Now imagine I'm writing a book. There's no visual. And it is coming not in real time, as broadcast or digital videos often do, but let's say 6 months later, 8 months later. I have to re-invoke so many things. I have to recreate the scene, and I have to use a very different kind of writing because there's no visual tools for it. I have to recreate that feeling, not just the scene, but that sense of despair. So I find writing incredibly difficult. And I find it so difficult that, in fact, this book was born in Oxford. A few months ago, I was a visiting fellow at the Reuters Institute. Some of you may be familiar with it, at Green College here. And I knew that I couldn't sit in Delhi and write it because I would be too distracted by the news. So I said, let me at least start by going somewhere, and I would cry every night. One, I think I was dealing with everything that I had seen. I was dealing with the death of my father, who I lost to COVID. But I also found it incredibly difficult. Either I didn't want to remember, or I didn't have the words. But it's a lot of labor. And you know, you would know this being from the world of arts. It's a lot of labor. And I remember a teacher at Columbia had told me, where I studied my second master's, write like you speak, only better. So the difficulty about writing is, when you read it, the reader can't feel you've put labor into it. The reader has to feel, what a simply told book. Oh, this is so accessible. Oh, this is so easy to follow. But you have to labor really hard to make it simple. So it was very difficult.
Thank you. Looking at your book, To Hell and Back, I've just spent last 3 days reading the book. A PDF, a printout of 3 days.
Oh, you have a hard copy now, yes.
Thank you. And this has been one of the most sort of traumatic experiences which I've gone through over the last 3 days. And I have looked at every story. And I come from the performing arts. Do you know how many stories are there? Have you counted the number of stories you have referred? I mean, if I were to make, it's for me, you know, while watching it on one level, it's like Ben-Hur. It's the biggest story after partition, as I read actually. And but at the same time, it's like a Netflix series for me. Every chapter is kind of, you know, can be filmed actually in my head. But then I was just thinking about the number of characters who appear, number of stories. Do you know, have you got a count of those stories?
I just know that I have to do a story on you because your questions are just so interesting. I didn't count, but I'll tell you something. One thing I was very conscious of is that everybody should have a name. So you will never see in this book that laborer, that businessman, the wife of so-and-so, the husband of so-and-so. Everybody is a person with a name and a story of their own, and that is why Humans of COVID. And the reason that I did that very consciously was because as I traveled through India, the one thing that everybody told me is that will we be counted? And they didn't just mean will we be counted as among the dead or among the recovered, whether here or in other parts of the world or in our own subcontinent. There were always dashboards, there was data, but people didn't want to be numbers. People wanted to be people. People had struggles, people also had triumphs. There was a mirror held up to our prejudices, but there was also a mirror held up to our enormous compassion, the capacity for people to turn to each other, the capacity for hope among heartbreak. And the one thing I promised myself is that if I can't name a person, I will not include that person in the book. There were others. There were other people I met. I lost their phone numbers. I couldn't call them. Didn't know their stories. They were fleeting. They were a fleeting presence. I had to throw. Another lesson in writing from Columbia was learn to kill your lovelies. There's so many things you want to include. Kill your darlings, as it's called. You have to learn not everything can go into a piece of writing. So only people whose stories I could tell, who would stay with the reader, whom the reader felt that the reader would know, are the stories there. And it was a very, very conscious, it's interesting, I should count, but it was a very, very conscious attempt to say that these are all human beings. And somehow that is how I like to tell stories. When I look back at Kargil also, I wanted every soldier to have a name. People were writing about the guns and the rocket launchers and territory, and I was telling stories of this boy is 24 years old. What does he feel when he wears a uniform and he has to go and fight? What is he thinking? Vulnerability is a very important element in the writing that I do and the storytelling that I do.
That's brilliant because while reading every story, I was wondering how poignant every story was and how complete every story was. And of course, your style of writing and and then your memory about every individual. And I stayed there kind of really wondering why and how you could do that. And then I wondered maybe you filmed everything. You can look at actually your visuals and you can translate them. But I would like to really know the process. How did you put this book together?
It's a very interesting question. I had filmed a lot of things in my journey, but I had to do fresh reporting on all of it. And what I mean by fresh reporting is, let's say there was a story of a young 15-year-old girl, Jyoti, who cycled with her father sitting behind on her cycle, 1,200 kilometers from Delhi to Darbhanga in Bihar. And she became such a cause célèbre at that time that Ivanka Trump, because it was still the Trump government in power, tweeted about her like she was some sporting champion instead of a very young girl who was in trauma. Now Jyoti, she'd made the headlines. I'd also done a small interview with her. But when it came to writing the book, I said, no, I have to go back to Jyoti's village. What happened to Jyoti after she went home? Has anyone bothered to find out that after, millions of India's poorest citizens walked home or cycled home, as in this case, what happened to them once they reached home? What was the idea of home? Did their lives change? Did they just come back to the city? So I went to her village. Similarly, there were scraps of little phone numbers I had, maybe people I found walking on the highways, and I spoke to them for 2 minutes. Now I had to find them again. Yeah. So one was finding them, talking to them again, updating myself on what had happened to their lives. There was another story, very tragic story of a man who, you see, the poor in India during the lockdown, the only assets the poor had were phones. So when they lost, because many of them were daily wage workers, when they lost their source of employment, they said, how do we manage now? So they went and sold their phones. Now a phone call got them about a couple of ₹1,000. So there's a story I tell of a house painter called Mukesh Mandal. Now in our part of the world, house painter is not a house painter here. A house painter is, if there's a big construction coming up, there will be one man who will get just literally minimum wage to go and, plaster some wall, mend something. So this is the kind of work he used to do. Now, when the lockdown happened and all economic activity came to a standstill, he felt very worried. How am I going to feed my family? So he sold his phone. It was very hot in Delhi. He lived on the outskirts of Delhi. It was very hot. So he went and bought a fan with some of that money. And he went and bought some lentils, some wheat, some rice. And he came back and he gave it to his wife, Poonam. And Poonam was relieved. She was happy. She said, okay, next 10 days, maybe we'll be okay. But the next morning, something consumed him. He took Poonam's, it's called a dupatta, a scarf, and he tied it to the bamboo pole, one of the poles that held up the four corners of their one-room tenement, and he took his own life. Now, I went back, to answer your thing, I went back to his family a year. Before I wrote this book, I went back to as many people as I could. Then the other thing in the process was finding the narrative. What was the narrative? And the way I tackled that was to say that I had to convey the emotions of us as a people, as a nation, as a world. What were the emotions? And the emotions were despair, anguish, fear, hope, strength, resilience. This is how I thought of it. And of course, science. Let us not underestimate that human spirit is captured in science and research. And it was here, Oxford AstraZeneca in partnership with the Serum Institute in India that our main vaccine, Covishield, was manufactured. So once I had found the emotions and the narrative, I then started looking at all my material and organizing it in that way. Now this makes it seem as a very deliberate process. There were a lot of hits and misses, a lot of trial and error, a lot of writing drafts that I hated. You saw them on the screen, so this doesn't make any sense, and a lot of rewriting. So if anyone tells you, there might be some people in the world who are brilliant enough to not need several drafts. I certainly needed more than a few drafts.
Thank you. Now, this is the time when the world has come back
Yes.
to kind of normalcy.
Yes.
Everybody's trying to escape.
Yeah.
Everybody's trying to forget.
Yes.
Reading your book, I've just gone through that roller coaster of horror, which actually I lived every day through press and media, because that's what happened on television,
Yes.
on my screen. And there is a tendency to kind of really move on. And at that time, reading this book and reading it again, in one of the chapters you say, I decided to write this story. What is the purpose of writing this story?
Another great question, and I'll tell you something I told my publisher. I told Chiki Sarkar, who's my publisher, that even if nobody reads this book, I have to write it. And why did I say that? It's not because it's a terrible book, I think it's a good book. But I knew that the human instinct is to want to block out when something very big happens to us and it's not happy. How do we deal with it? We mostly deal with it by trying to forget it. And a lot of times when I go to talk about my book at events like these, I always say to the audience that I know your instinct would be, I don't want to read this because I don't want to remember COVID. And I'll say 2-3 things there. One, I think there's no healing or there's no moving on if you move on without dealing with memory. This is true for all aspects of life. It's true for failed relationships, it's true for deaths, it's true for, let's talk about partition. There is a professor, we're at a university, we must talk about something from academia. There is a sociologist in India by the name of Ashish Nandi, very well respected man. One of his seminal projects is on memory and partition. And Professor Nandi did this project to make the argument that one of the reasons, and this will interest our friends from Pakistan, one of the reasons that India and Pakistan have this psychological festering wound is because they never dealt with the memory of the rupture called partition. For different reasons. If for Pakistan a new nation was birthed, for India it was like losing part of yourself. In either case, there was a rupture. There was something cataclysmic that happened, and Professor Nandi said that because neither of these countries, our countries, dealt with this rupture, this wound manifests itself in different ways. And he did this almost psychoanalytical study of the two countries to say, if you block out memory, there is no healing. Today you go to any therapist, the therapist will tell you this. Go to a therapist and say, as people have said to me, people said to me after my father died, Barkha, you have not grieved, you are trying to move on without confronting the feeling, you will not heal. So it is the same thing. We have to acknowledge that the world went through something probably larger than anything we will ever experience again. It dislocated us emotionally, it frightened us physically. For many people, there remained a lockdown. For me, even the counter experience, I had no lockdown. I was just traveling all the time. In hospitals, in slums, in back of trucks, inside trains, walking with the workers, and so on. There is no healing in moving on without dealing with memory. So I felt it was very important to chronicle what had happened to us. Secondly, I believe this book is not about COVID. COVID is almost incidental to this book. This book is not a medical book. This book is about human beings. This book is about what happens when we're scared. How does fear manifest itself sometimes as prejudice and sometimes as love? How did completely, from the same event, some extraordinarily cruel things happened and some extraordinarily beautiful things happened. Like I tell the story of a Muslim man called Abdul Malbari, who runs a trust called Ekta. Ekta in Hindi means unity. And there's an ambulance in this gentleman's office. Office is just one closet. And on the ambulance it says, funerals for lonely humans. And Mr. Malbari devoted his life to performing the last rites of those who had nobody by their side. And in COVID, we saw a lot of people abandoning bodies. Some didn't know who was the family. In some cases, out of fear, the bodies were being abandoned. Mr. Malbari is a practicing Muslim who had Ganga Jal. Ganga is the river that we as Hindus consider the most sacred. And in the last rites of Hindus, Ganga Jal. And there's a rosary of beads. He had the Ganga Jal and the rosary, and he had the namaz mat. Because he didn't at that time distinguish, but he wanted to give the dignity of that person's individual faith to their last rites. So for me, this book is about human capacity, about heartbreak, about hope, about how sometimes there is intimacy of strangers. You know, people survived the second wave in particular in India by turning to each other. Gurudwaras, where some of you may be familiar, there's a concept called langar. That's the meals that usually Gurudwaras give. This time they had oxygen langars. They had oxygen cylinders outside the streets of major Gurudwaras because oxygen ran short for us in the second wave. And oxygen, as you know, was one of the main treatments for COVID. And people rich and poor would come up in cars, and those who were too poor in cycle rickshaws, and they would sit on the road, and there would be these giant cylinders, and they would take a sort of deep breath. They would be allowed to breathe for 15-20 minutes, and they would move. So there were just these incredible moments of our humanity, of our cruelty, of our ability to bounce back, of our priorities, of our inequalities, of our, you know, as Charles Dickens says, it wasn't ever the best of times, but you know, there was a dualism which we carry as human beings. And for me, this is a book about us. It's about, you will all see shades of your life. It doesn't even matter if you're not Indian. You will see shades of what you went through, or shades of somebody you loved and what they went through in this book. And that is why I wrote it.
Now, can you read the passage from the book, please?
Okay.
How much more time is left?
Take your time. We are enjoying it now.
I will read a personal passage just because in the beginning I was asked, when did I first know or recognize that I was being asked for autographs? And I said I hated being the story. In COVID, I unfortunately became the story I was reporting briefly. Not in the first year, but in the second year. When after spending a year and a half covering the COVID story, I not just lost my father to COVID, but what he went through, even with all my privilege and all the people I knew, I was not poor and walking on the roads in the way that our most marginalized people were. But in so many ways, I saw that everything I'd been reporting about other people had now started happening to me. So I will just read this passage from a chapter called Fathers and Daughters. And just for context, this is how the chapter is introduced. Everything ran short in the peak months of the second wave. Vaccines, oxygen, beds, ambulances, and drugs. Despair gave birth to a community of grief as people turned to each other for help. Civil society had to supplement and in some cases substitute for institutional responses. Twitter became a message board for notices about plasma, remdesivir, and oxygen concentrators. The kindness of strangers saw many people through the worst months of their lives. I was away in Maharashtra when I got the phone call I had dreaded all these months. What unfolded next made me the very story I had been reporting. And this is about memory, because you spoke about memory and I spoke about how if you suppress memory, you don't heal. They say it gets better with time, but it doesn't really. The first thing that has altered in my life is that I cannot listen to music anymore. My father, S.P. Dutt, Speedy Dutt to friends and family alike, used to spend hours at his ramshackle workstation, sitting in a corner of his airless room amid a mountain of books, dusty files, and mechano toys that he had designed and built himself, listening to music on internet radio stations. Christmas carols, soft rock, Santana, there was a 24/7 loop of music on his aging Apple desktop. Every time I hear the opening chords of a song, a memory draws me back to that image of him, and I feel the pain cut me like a knife. It seems easier to not listen to music at all. I had begun to think of myself as peculiar till I read an account by Michelle Zauner in the New Yorker magazine about how she would collapse in tears every time she went to shop in the H-Mart, the Korean supermarket. The dry food cans would trigger an immediate association for her with her mother. Memory can be a beast. That is my abiding personal lesson from this pandemic. Before his death, my sister Bahar and I always valorized our mother Prabha Dutt, whom we lost when I was just 13 years old to a brain hemorrhage. She was a flamboyant, volatile, tempestuous counterfoil to the gentle, unassuming, kindly and eccentric man her husband was. Among the first generation of women journalists in India, she was the automatic headline story of her family. Notoriously rebellious, she was India's first woman war correspondent, reporting from the front line of the India-Pakistan war in 1965 by herself, armed with only a notepad and a pen. We grew up in her shadow, molded by extraordinary stories of how she once jumped into a hippopotamus enclosure to chase a story, how she petitioned the court and entered the annals of case law by insisting on interviewing child murderers Billa and Ranga before they were executed, and how she exposed corruption and wrongdoing through her writings in the Hindustan Times. She was a legend, and because she died so young, she was just 40, the memory of her grew larger than life in our heads. It was easy then to take the person right in front of us, our father, for granted. It took losing him to COVID for me to realize how he had been the epicenter of my existence. It took his death for me to understand how traumatized he must have been, especially as a single parent, every time I left for an assignment to a dangerous hotspot. I remember his protestations and anxieties 2 decades ago when I was dispatched to report on the Kargil war in 1999. I was dismissive with him, impatient and stubborn. And the truth is, he set me free, entirely so, even when he had to sit on his hands. Every day, I curse myself for not appreciating him fully, as I should have when he was alive. And now it is too late. I have lost count of the number of daughters I have met in my travels across India who are similarly haunted by loss, by regret, by anger, by what-ifs, and by memory.
Thank you. Now, you talked about your mother. But what was your relationship with her? Do you have memories of those?
Yes. I don't know. It's a strange thing to say about your mother who died when you were 13 years old, but she was, she's larger than life in my head now, but I have a feeling if she'd remained alive, we would have fought a lot. Because she was very stern. My father was very gentle and generous, and my mother was very stern, strict parent, total tiger mom, wanted us to do everything. You know, you must learn how to dance, you must play basketball, you must swim, you must also do well at studies, you must debate, you must do this, and my father was always, it's okay, do whatever you want to. And I think all our families have one of either kind, where we have two, we have one of either kind. So I always feel that if my mother had lived longer, I would have had ferocious fights with her.
Have you got any mentors?
I think she was my mentor, even though she wasn't there to be my mentor. But that guiding spirit, to grow up as, to give you context, when my mother became a journalist and she went to Hindustan Times to apply for a job, she was told that we don't take women in news. If as a woman you want to be a reporter, you can cover the flower show. So I grew up with these stories. I grew up with the struggles of a generation of women before me. And I grew up knowing that every generation of women opens doors for another generation of women who come after. And we don't fully appreciate how much the women before us have done for us till we're a little older. When you're in your 20s and your 30s, you just take it for granted. It takes being older and comfortable in your skin as a middle-aged woman, which is what I am today, to actually realize that I couldn't have got here had it not been a generation of women who came before me. And I hope someday the generation that comes after me will also understand the number of battles. When you fight these battles, you don't fight just for yourself, you fight for an entire generation of women.
So now the book is here, it's published, it's designed. And in the same chapter, which you read, you talk about not listening to music.
Yes.
But if there was any piece of music associated to this book, what that piece of music would be?
Yes. Thank you for that question. And I really haven't been able to listen to, only once I was in a restaurant, I was eating dinner and a song played that my father used to listen to, and I immediately burst into tears. So it is really very difficult. But I thought that I must talk about hope, because in the end, this book is not just about sorrow. It is also about hope. And I remembered that when we were small, my sister and I, my father used to play it was almost like a nursery rhyme, but when you hear its words, they're quite deep. It was from a movie called The Muppet Movie. It was a movie from our childhood. But it had a song called The Rainbow Connection. And I end the book with this song, and I just read out with your permission of this. As I think of all the things I should have said to my father while he was still alive, I'm haunted by the hum of one of my favorite tunes. A song from the Muppet Movie, a childhood staple that suddenly seems to have new meaning about hope and optimism in a midlife that has been sullied by sorrow. And this is the music, these are the words of the song. Why are there so many songs about rainbows? And what's on the other side? Rainbows are visions, but only illusions. And rainbows have nothing to hide. So we've been told, and some choose to believe it. But I know they're wrong. Wait and see. Someday we'll find it. The rainbow connection. The lovers, the dreamers, and me. Who said that every wish would be heard and answered when wished on the morning star? Somebody thought of that, and someone else believed it. And look what it's done so far. What's so amazing that keeps us stargazing? And what do we think we might see? Someday we'll find it, that rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me. All of us under its spell. We know that it's probably magic. Have you been half asleep? And have you heard voices? I've heard them calling my name. Is this the sweet sound that calls the young sailors? The voice might be one and the same. I've heard it too many times to ignore it. It's something I'm supposed to do. Someday we'll find it, the rainbow connection, the lovers, the dreamers, and me.
Thank you, Barkha. Now, I sort of wanted to see if you were to, when you talk about going through COVID yourself,
Yes.
and losing the taste and smell.
Yes.
If this book was to be a piece of art, a visual art, who would have painted this? Which artist comes into your mind? If this was a dish, what would be this dish? If this was a flower, what sort of flower would you imagine it to be?
I think if it was a flower, it would be a lily. Because lilies are shut and then they bloom. And I kind of think of how we've emerged from those 2 years as something like that. That you shut down and then you open, and you shut down and you open. It's a process of living. If this were a dish, it would have to be something that was sweet and savory at the same time. That hits you with the force of mustard but has the comfort of honey. Honey mustard, I think. And if it were an artist, that is a tougher question. Anju Dodia is somebody I admire very much, and I think that in her artwork there is strength and sorrow both. And I feel that she captures, she might be somebody who would get this.
Brilliant. Thank
Thank you.
You know, I'm in the world of production.
Yes.
And for the 75th year anniversary of
Yes.
Indian independence, I was plotting to create a show. And then I was told, sorry, partition is something which we
Can't talk about,
again
yeah.
and again. Don't want to do. And then looking at this book, I was almost sort of plotting to celebrate 80th anniversary of Indian independence with a text like that, which is kind of really epic. It is so big that maybe 5 years later people will be able to kind of face it.
Yeah, I think you've got the essence of it, right? This book is something that I think you've got the essence of it. Two things. One, that you've recognized that in this sorrow there is something to celebrate. Two, the scale. But three, most importantly, this is a book for the times. It may not be read immediately, but when we are ready, and there will be a day when we're ready, that's why I wrote it.
And that's brilliant, because after Indian partition, if you really look back,
this has been the most cataclysmic event of our lives, yeah.
Indian cinema did not sort of really talk about it. We kept on facing, but I think, they were only...
Garam Hawa and, I can think of a handful.
Like Mantu and Yashpal who possibly wrote about it.
Yes.
But rest or couldn't sing. So
Yes.
about that.
Yes.
It's too soon, and it's wonderful, and congratulations.
Thank you. And thank you for such thoughtful questions.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. And I would like to open to now to the
It was
audiences.
natural and calamity
Yes.
that coronavirus was there.
Yes.
But still you see that between two countries there is a very fatal kind of poisons which are given by both nations. So do you feel that, or you are optimistic that as this coronavirus is going to be over, that situation and there will be peace, harmony and solidarity between these two nations?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, there are structural problems between India and Pakistan, the states. I don't think it stops us from being friends as people. And I think we have to be able to separate these strands. There are the collisions of our states, their disagreements, there are ups and downs. It's almost like a schizophrenic relationship. There's love-hate schizophrenia, there's familiarity and yet there's strangeness. I try to take it back also to Professor Nandi's seminal work, which I urge you to look at. But I think that I have learned over time to not conflate the problems of the states, which will carry on one track, with the capacity to make deep connections with individuals. And I think I have at least 2 friends from Lahore who I count among my closest friends. And I'm still the person who can go to Kargil and report as a ferociously patriotic Indian, as there would be somebody on the other side who would bring their perspective as a Pakistani to it. And we have to recognize that both of these things are possible. It is possible to have a close personal connection with somebody in Pakistan and yet have your identity as a very patriotic Indian and their identity as a very patriotic Pakistani. And there is no contradiction between the two.
Yes.
Barkha, having read, of course, an absolutely heart-wrenching book, I wondered, you know, not only you as an author, because I think you've mentioned that you owe it to a few doctors, you've acknowledged them, but as a journalist and as your fellow, you know, people in your profession, being in the front line, whether they are insurgencies or, you know, in the war zone area, and COVID was no less than a war zone area. How do you protect your mental health, and what kind of help have you, you know, every sector here has a doctor, nurses can go somewhere. Is there something you can go to?
So before I answer about myself, I'll tell you the story of a nurse who told me that she found the 26/11 terror attacks easier to deal with than COVID. Yogita. It's so nice to see people who read the book. Thank you for that. And she said to me, that attack had a beginning, a middle and an end. COVID doesn't seem to have an end. So we really saw people go through all kinds of strange things that we want to pretend it didn't happen. You know, from our health workers wearing PPE kits which blocked oxygen to their brains and they reacted in different emotional ways that they didn't even understand was a mental health issue at that time, to those who were at the front line carrying that the sort of stain of that sorrow, to a very important thing. It may not have happened here, but in our part of the world, schools physically shut. And our children lost language skills, memory skills, cognitive skills. We had little girls pushed back into child marriage because their parents said, what are you doing? Chalo, shadi kar lete hain, get them married. So to answer your question, we have in the debris of our recovery, is not just long COVID, which scientists are still researching, and you read a lot about it here. I know here there are long COVID clinics, and I've interviewed some of the doctors who run them here. But in that debris is also our emotional wasteland, to borrow T.S. Eliot's phrase. And for me personally, I must confess that I have not yet reached the point. For me, the book was a beginning of some healing. It was very difficult, but it was at least an expression of grief. Through 2 years, even after my father's death, I had no expression of grief because I had to remain a functional reporter. And I just kept reporting and kept reporting and kept reporting. But I'll tell you the ways in which it impacted me. I can no longer sleep. Not listening to music is one cost. I cannot sleep. I wake up after 1 hour. I cry. I always cried easily, but now I cry very easily. I'm quick to temper, quick to tears, quick to every emotion is quicker. Life suddenly feels like it's very short. You know, you feel like you have to grab every moment. So there's a kind of absence of stability. That's the way I would describe how do I protect myself? Firstly, by acknowledging it. I feel no embarrassment in acknowledging it. If you acknowledge something and you say it out loud, it automatically feels a little less frightening. It's still frightening, but a little less frightening than it would be if you were carrying it alone in yourself. There's no protection against the mental health damage that comes from an episode or a long experience like this, except to live it. And one thing I've learned is not to bury memory, which is why I wrote this book. And I try by allowing myself the emotion that I feel, by owning it.
India is very polarized at the moment, so is media. Where do you see Indian media heading in the near future?
So there are kinds and kinds of Indias and there are kinds and kinds of media. They say about my country that everything you say about it and its opposite is simultaneously true, right? There's no one India. There's a lot, that multiplicity of truths is what I love my country for. Yes, there is a polarization and it's very suffocating as a storyteller and journalist. I don't want, whatever my personal beliefs may be, I want to be a free storyteller. I want to tell what I see as I see it. I don't want to be in this camp, this wing, this ideology, that ideology. I have my personal beliefs, of course I do. But when I'm telling a story, even if something I see contradicts my personal belief, I owe it to the truth of that story to tell it as I see it. Unfortunately, what is happening in India, by the way, is happening globally. This is happening globally. This polarization of the media, the Americans had it before anybody else. You had CNN and Fox. You had rather MSNBC and Fox, with CNN trying to occupy the center. So this kind of polarized media, journalists being pulled in different directions, you know, the complete inability to have a conversation which is about differences and still laugh at the end. I want to invoke that time. I want to invoke that time where I could go to my neighbor's house and have a ferocious argument and have that person say, but at least eat a samosa before you go. What happened to us? When did we, you see, again, the value of food is very important. When did we stop being those people who could agree to disagree? When did conversations break down? When did a person with a different opinion become an enemy? I think if there was a silver lining in COVID, it's a very strange place to look for a silver lining. But when something larger than yourself happens, at least for that brief moment, I found that people were able to turn to each other without that filter of which party you support, which ideology you support, because it was just human being to human being. And I would just say about the media, yes, there is a section of television media I feel very disillusioned with. But I also say to people that you have to be willing to support the media you believe in. You see, people, for the price of 2 Starbucks coffees a month, you can actually support independent journalism. So whoever you like, you know, doesn't have to be me or Mojo's Story which I run, it can be somebody else. Support them. Because there are actually journalists who are trying to create in India a space for themselves without big corporate money, without government money, without political interference. They're being lone warriors, but they need the support of people who believe in them. You have another question? Yes, okay.
As you're quite a trailblazer.
Yes.
In Indian journalism. So how do you deal with all the trolls and all the? I've always wondered that.
You know, I'll tell you.
The maximum.
Yeah, I'll tell you the liberating thing about growing older. I just don't care. I literally don't care. But I'll tell you, I'll answer it more honestly than that. There was a time when I was younger that I used to think that when somebody writes something to you on Twitter which is rude or really abusive almost, or they make an allegation, there's some wild allegation, they actually want to hear your point of view. So I would laboriously sit there and answer, no, this happened, I said this because of this, no, it wasn't like this, no. And then I was in my 20s when this used to happen, and then I realized, oh my God, this is so silly. They don't want to really engage with you in a conversation. They just want to get under your skin and irritate you and upset you so that you think 100 times before you express your opinion the next time. They just want to silence you. They want to intimidate you. They want to bully you. And you cannot let that happen. And I focus on all the love I get. Right? We pay too much attention to these chaps. I think most of them are chaps. We pay too much attention to them. And I have learned, one, that I mostly have to answer to my conscience. I'm never going to be able to please. Even people who love me will love me at times and hate me at times, among my readers and viewers. It's the nature of the job we do. When you see in my work something that you think, confirmation bias, you'll say, what a good journalist. When you see in my work something you really disagree with, you'll say, oh, what a biased journalist, right? This happens. You have to learn to sort of grow out of it and focus on the great things. Focus on how many people will walk up to you and say, you know, I mean, I was interviewing some girl today, before I came here, I was doing a show, and she said she'd gone to jail for a Facebook post. And she should never have gone to jail for that Facebook post. And she came out. And I was interviewing her, and I said, you know, how are you so strong? And she said, you know, I was in school when I saw this so-and-so report by you. And I really thought you were like a strong woman. And you know, you meet these young women in some different corners of the world, and they'll tell you how you changed their life. That's enough for me. Who cares about trolls?
Reporting Kagalwar
Yes.
and writing this book, both tasks are really very difficult.
Yes.
So, what do you think? Reporting Kagalwar was difficult, or writing this book was?
You know, I call...
You know that in Kargil war, one of our person lost even the job.
Yes.
our Prime Minister.
Yes. And then got it back, and then lost it again, and then got it back, and then lost it again, and then got it back and lost it again.
Once again, he got back.
No, of course, you're talking about Nawaz Sharif, who claimed that Pervez Musharraf had launched that incursion without his knowledge, be that as it may. The war was a transformative experience of my life because I had just returned from Colombia. I had no exposure to conflict. I had never seen a dead body. Since then, I covered conflict, insurgency, war, riots, calamity, now COVID. But you think of a 20-something who's never seen a body, who's never seen violence, who's never seen bombs go off, who's never almost died. It was a life and death experience. It was a masterclass for me, not just as a journalist, but in the lessons of life. I always say that my life story, if my journalism were to end right now, which it's not going to, but let's say suppose it were to, then these are the two episodes that bookend my journalistic life. From Kargil to COVID is more than 20 years now. And it is similar in one thing that I realize that it's not that I'm not scared. It's not that I had no fear in Kargil. It's not that I had no fear in COVID. But that something larger than fear takes over you when you're truly passionate about something. And it helps you deal with the fear, or it displaces the fear. So they were both very different in terms of the fear and how I handled them. COVID lasted much longer. Kargil, the danger was visible. COVID, the danger was invisible. You didn't know where it was coming from. In Kargil, I could see the bombs falling on me. I could see I was seeing grown men fall. Kargil was life-altering, and so was COVID. And they're apples and oranges, except for the fact that both transformed me at a very deep level and defined me as a journalist. Yes.
I think in the COVID epidemic, one biggest, I would say biggest crime which was done, the data were not released, what exact was. So I would say, like, I would not go exactly in what was the mortality exactly, but definitely it was hidden by the government. So what the government
So I'm not an epidemiologist.
There was a sentence, beautiful sentence in the book about people not acknowledging the numbers.
So I am not an epidemiologist, and I don't think we know how many people died. I don't think we know, neither the WHO nor the official figures. I have personally written a lot about this in my book, which you can read, but I have called for the census. And by the way, underreported deaths have happened globally. Underreported deaths have happened globally. And there have been calls in all countries to reconcile the actual numbers with the official numbers. And I have called for a very simple solution to this. To settle this debate, there's going to be a census. We are due for another census in India. And I think that you can go and ask families. Because what happened was that a lot of, especially in rural India, a lot of people died at home. They died at home untested. So if you didn't have an RT-PCR test, you were not counted among the dead, and so on. Or they died in the ambulance, or they died on the streets. So I would simply say that India, like other parts of the world, went through something that was a global phenomenon. It is going to take us decades to understand the exact scale and the exact depth. But let us lead the way by being transparent and by encouraging people, in the census possibly, to do some new data collection so that we can better understand it and learn from it.
Thank you, Barkha.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. My brief was to only talk about the book, but please let my ask other questions. And thank you, Padmesh, and to Prabha Khaitan Foundation, British Council, and anybody else, please include. Thank you.
And to you, thank you.
This has been one of the best conversations and talks I have attended, and both of you gave this opportunity for me for hosting this. And at the premises also with this college, on behalf of all my colleagues, I'm sure everyone enjoyed it, and it opened our mind out of student enrollment, student numbers, resources, visas, submissions, and that's all happens here. It was wonderful, and when it comes to partition, I tell my friends that India, Pakistan, Bangladesh was one under British rule.
Yeah.
It still is one under British rule. So thank you so much everyone for supporting the event, and thank you so much for being here. And now you all can have your picture with the author and signed book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for